And I think you and I have talked about this in the past. When you think about the Mexican novelas or the Venezuelan novelas or any type of novela, even the Brazilian ones, who gets to be represented, and it's
Mm-hmm.
usually the elite from those societies who happen to be the white Europeans. So I think in some ways people don't see themselves reflected. They don't see African faces, they don't see black faces, they don't see indigenous faces in those mediums other than in very stereotypical. All right, so we are the brown perspective, and since we are in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month or Latino Heritage Month, depending on how you identified yourself, we wanted to talk about Latinidad, that. But before we do that, just go ahead and welcome our Mero Mero RO to this conversation.
¿Qué hubo? ¿Qué pasó?
Aquí estamos celebrando el mes de la Latinidad, de la herencia hispana. There's been a lot of conversation lately because of the really what happened with the Black Lives Matter. I think there's been a, an important conversations being had not only in the U.S. but across the world and also in Latin America about racial identity and discrimination and injustice there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that there's been more awareness about how racist Latino culture, Hispanic culture has been, and also trying to understand what do we call ourselves? Do we want to call ourselves by our basic, with the identity that we identify with the most, like whether that's Afro, Indigenous, European, or whatever it may be? Or do we try to figure out how we continue to have a collective identity as people who have experienced a lot of the same things because of the history of colonization.
So I pulled up this article here, and it says Latinidad is being canceled by Afro and indigenous people who do not see themselves represented. Are these specific groups that have managed to bring in a coalition of Afro and indigenous people? Do you know? Or is it just like a community on social media? Do they have representatives that are writing on here, either on Me Too or others? Or do you know how the movement started to gain momentum?
No, not too much actually. So I know that Me Too is one of the first places, big sources that we seen that at least I saw this, and I know that for those of you who may not know, there is within the community there's a differentiation between calling yourself Hispanic and Latino. I think Hispanic was a term that was used in the 70s, I believe, to just find a way to identify those who were either from Latin America or also Spain. And obviously, some people don't feel that the label Hispanic applies to them because if you grew up in Latin America, if you grew up in Colombia like I did, or other parts, you have a mix of your culture and your racial identity is a mix of that European heritage for sure, but also of that African and that indigenous heritage. And Latino was the term that most people felt that captured not only the experience of those three racial groups, but also acknowledges that there's Brazil and other English
Mm-hmm.
speaking countries within South and Central America and the Caribbean. And I think you and I have talked about this in the past. When you think about the Mexican novelas or the Venezuelan novelas or any type of novela, even the Brazilian ones, who gets to be represented, and it's
Mm-hmm.
usually the elite from those societies who happen to be the white Europeans. So I think in some ways people don't see themselves reflected. They don't see African faces, they don't see black faces, they don't see indigenous faces in those mediums other than in very stereotypical
Right. So,
roles.
yeah. So, Latinidad being canceled means that we're getting rid of the label Latino altogether. Yet this article is still using the word Latino to refer to them. It's just the way that they wrote it. I would have thought, if I'm writing this, I would have said the outdated term Latino excludes a large portion of the communities of the Americas, non-white communities of the Americas. Because if you're going to come present an article and it seems like it's making the case for why you want to do this, then you're still using that term to identify the community, right? So this is what I was trying to understand. That there's no difference between Latinidad and Latino. What you just explained right now is accurate. It's the Latinos that we see on Univision and Telemundo, which are it's usually Eurocentric, and they favor specific characteristics because they think that it has that universal white appeal. And so indigenous people and Afro-Americanos have felt excluded for a long time. So I could see that. And so this is a pushback against that. And I'm actually, in that sense, I do agree with this because I've been critical of Univision and all those novelas and the way they cast for over a decade now. I mean, I stopped supporting Univision and Telemundo to a large extent because I felt that they didn't represent me. I mean, first of all, I thought that they talked down to me like if my community is full of idiots, but I also felt that they just never, they were behind the curve, even behind the curve of some American productions, like in movies and sitcoms, putting, at least making an effort to have more representation. I mean, you have the movie Coco, which came out here a few years ago, that they tried to at least try to tell an authentic story and use dark skinned characters and so forth. And you don't even see that in our Latin American countries. So they're behind the curve on that. And that was always my biggest criticism of these channels. So I agree with that. But then they also switch here to the Hispanic label. So Latinidad is also canceling the use of the term Hispanic. It's a pushback against both classifications that have been to some extent imposed on a group of people that it never actually represented. Is that correct?
So yeah, so they are looking to cancel the term Hispanic, and I think in some respects the term Hispanic has been canceled already, and it was canceled by Latino because, again, I think people wanted a term that incorporated the Black, indigenous, the mixed nature of our Latin American heritage. So in some ways that has been canceled or minimized or better understood, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I think my thing is, I respect if you are an Afro descendant, if you are an indigenous person, or you are Latino who really identifies yourself as a European, feel free to identify yourself as such. But then there's a number of us, and myself included, who, whether it's culturally and also because I did my DNA test, I know that I have these three roots in my blood and my DNA. So I do feel that I need to, I need a term that represents me, and Latinidad represents me. And I also want that term to be better reflective of the entirety of the Latino experience, including indigenous culture, including Afro culture, and yeah, and also including the European things that we do have, like our language and some of our other traditions.
But that's also because you were raised in South America. So I would think that someone that is a second generation Colombian or Mexican or Central American living in the US, that the word Latino has a very different meaning for them, because you were 12 or 14 when you came to this country from Colombia. And by then you had already built your identity around how you identify yourself. And that's just based on how that plays out in Colombia. So you identify with either your mixed heritage, your indigenous heritage, your Afro heritage, or even your European heritage. I'm not sure, but there's a link to it. And you see it reinforced whether it's in the schools, in the Independence Day, in like every single aspect of your life. All of that is getting reinforced and building your identity. So when you come to the US, when you hear the word Latino, instead of assigning a new meaning to the word Latino, you just take everything you already know about your background, and that's the assignment that you give to the Latino word. So it's linked to your background. But for someone that grew up in the United
Mm.
States, uh,
I think what gets reinforced in Colombia and any other country is you're Colombian, you're Mexican, you're Puerto Rican, you're Peruvian, and that history is ingrained. And sometimes, unfortunately, that history is very Eurocentric, or that that some of that is beginning to change. But I think the concept of Latinidad is not doesn't really come to life until you come and live to the United States and you realize that, okay, like I'm Colombian, but I have a lot of things that are very similar to Mexicans because I grew up with a lot of Mexican shows and
mhm.
music and culture, Puerto Ricans and Guatemalans and things like that. So there's this appreciation for how connected we are, and the realization that we are to a large extent the same people, just with slight variations of stories and language and accents, because they were just developed according to whatever groups and traditions were there at the time.
But
So I identify myself, and I think that's changed, right? Colombian American, Latino, Colombian descent. And but I do think that, my kids or their kids may identify very differently because they're identified as Latino, right? And depending on who who they married, who they love, they may be an even more mixing of the identity, and maybe they just identify themselves as Americans, right? As Latino Americans, as whatever the appropriate term or the designated term will be at that time.
yeah, but what I was commenting regarding the connection that you have between the word Latino and your upbringing in Colombia and your relationship to your culture there, it was in reference to you saying that you support the word Latino. So I was trying to, from my point of view, trying to see how you have associated a positive meaning to that word based on your upbringing that happened outside of this country. But you
Got
also,
it, because I'm proud of it, because I
right,
know my history.
exactly, because you're proud of it. And so to you, Latino is positive also because it represents all of that. Even though you also said that growing up in Colombia, some aspects of your identity were also not fully acknowledged or celebrated, like maybe the Afro side or the indigenous side.
Yeah, I
But
mean, very, very racist
right,
towards Afro descendants and indigenous people too.
right, but you still seem to be comfortable with the word Latino representing whatever your view is of your culture and your relationship with it, even though you know that it wasn't fully representing Afro and indigenous. And I think it sounds to me like what the people here in the United States are doing is the Latinos that grew up here, the second generation, they don't have that direct link to the culture because they didn't grow up in Mexico or Central America or Colombia. They grew up in the US, and all they know about their background and their culture is what they pick up from the parents, but they're also picking up a lot of other things from mainstream American culture. And so to them, Latino might represent exactly what it is that they see on Univision and what they see in their communities, which is all slanted and maybe not even celebrated as much, or it doesn't reinforce the indigenous side as much to the point where they're comfortable enough with accepting the term Latino. Because I can tell you, growing up in Mexico, even though that country is also, it has a class system, so you have, the racism is not overtly along like the color lines as black and white because you have a lot of mestizo in there, but there's definitely a ladder, and on the top is the white European, and then you have the indigenous, and then below the indigenous you have the blacks, to the extent that Mexicans are willing to to admit that there's
Mhm.
black Mexicans, right? But they always put them at the bottom. And but even in a culture like Mexico, like that that looks down on the indigenous people. In my town, for the Dia de la Virgen on December 12th, they always had these religious ceremonies where they would, from town to town, they would carry the picture of the Virgin Mary, and then they would take it to the central church, because each town has a church, and they would take it to the church. And as part of that whole event, in my town, they had a huge hill that the people from the town would climb at like 5 in the morning, and they would bring down the cross, because there was a cross on the hill, and they would bring it down to the church, and they would keep it there for a few days, and they would bring indigenous dancers, and the indigenous dancers were part of all that ceremony. And so while on the one sense Mexico sends you a message that indigenous people are inferior, they still celebrate aspects of the indigenous culture that gives you a positive association with them, because the people used to dress up, they used to have these like amazing costumes, and then it was a positive representation of Native Americans. And so I come to the United States, and I hear the word Latino for the first time, and I'm associating it with my upbringing in Mexico, which, as like I said, even though I know it's a classist country, that it still gave me positive reinforcement of my indigenous identity to some extent. And so, but I could see that lacking here for people from people that, for especially like Mexican Americans or Latinos that are not growing up in East LA, where they do the Aztec dances all the time. Like, where else do you get a celebration of your indigenous heritage, or even your Afro heritage?
Yeah, not too many places, like you said, unless you belong to one of those group, the danzantes, or maybe if you venture into the interior of the country and are somehow connected to the indigenous traditions of the northern tribes, whether it's the Sioux, or whether you practice those things. But yeah, there's not a lot of opportunities to celebrate and learn and practice those traditions.
And I'd say that I know Central American countries are probably similar to Mexico in the way they characterize and treat Native Americans. I'm not sure about South America, to be honest, but it's kind of trippy sometimes if you even think about how Native Americans are treated or depicted in Mexico. Because when I was there a few years ago, I went with a few of my cousins. We went to eat at a restaurant. It was nice, a restaurant, Spanish style restaurant, and we were eating obviously Mexican food. It was a Mexican restaurant in Mexico.
Mira no más.
There's Chinese food, there's pizza, and there's other stuff. But hey, if you're in Mexico, that's where you're gonna get the best tacos. That's where you're gonna get the best barbacoa. So you go to a Mexican place. So we go in there and we're sitting down and we're drinking some. I think I was drinking an agua preparada, which is mineral water with lime and salt. And I'm looking over at the wall, and there's this mural, and the mural has a painting, and it looks like a Diego Rivera style painting with the indigenous family in the fields working, and then you have the indigenous mother with the Native American, and it's celebrating that aspect of indigenous culture, the way they're depicting them. But then I looked at my cousins and I said, "Hey, look, check out that mural. I bet you if a family that was dressed like that walked into this restaurant, they'd probably kick them out, or they would give them faces." Because they would assume that they're poor, that they're begging, that they're not going to be able to pay for whatever food they order. So Mexico does celebrate its indigenous history, but it wants to celebrate it only in the abstract, only as long as it happened in the past. They don't want to deal with it in the present.
Yeah, I think similar things happen in Colombia. There's this idolization of the native peoples, and then unfortunately a lot of them have been impacted by the civil war and the warfare in the countryside. And oftentimes they had to move to the cities, and they're poor, they don't have the social connections, the education, the employment. Some of them don't speak Spanish.
Yeah, they don't even speak the
or
language.
spoke it poorly. So it's like, yeah, it's sad because a lot of people do suffer, and there's no acknowledgement of all of the discrimination and racism that obviously has led to to those communities facing the challenges that they do.
Yeah. And so going back to this new movement to try to cancel whatever it is that Latino represents, if people feel that it doesn't represent them, then my opinion is more power to you. They get now for the first time, Afro or indigenous people will get to decide what it is that they want to be called. And
Hmm.
it could be something like they could just be called Americanos. Hey, why not, right? We're Americans. South American, Central American, North Americans, they could go with that. They could go with something that is more specific to their experience, to their history. The only I would say maybe word of caution is that the more fine the group division is, and the smaller the groups are, the easier it is for somebody to then come along in the future and play each group against each other, because they'll just highlight the differences and they'll try to pit you against each other for their own gain. And so that's the only potential for any negative consequences of having all these classifications. It would be great if we could all just identify as the same thing, but realistically, there's so many differences. There's so much, even culturally, like Guatemalans and Mexicans. There's not much difference there, really. If you talk about the indigenous past, even the Maya spanned southern Mexico and Guatemala, and then the
Yeah.
experiences of the mestizos are very similar, but culturally, there's enough difference there that you can, even the way that Guatemalans speak, even sometimes maybe not the appearance, especially if it's indigenous from southern Mexico and Guatemala, but there's enough differences there that if you just try to lump them all together, then I could see how that causes problems. Because, for example, and then the further you go away from like the Central American, South American, you start getting into the Caribbean. There's enough differences there that people can just point to and say, look, I mean, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of difference as well. We shouldn't all be called the same thing. I mean, it'd be nice if we could all just like at least just maybe focus more on the similarities instead of the differences, but people don't work like that. So
Yeah. Pues como dicen los Tigres del Norte, somos más americanos. Somos
yeah.
doble americanos. And I think, but to your point, I think somehow I also see it, Latinidad, as a museum. And actually, ironically, right now, as a community, we're close to finally getting a national a bill that would support the establishment of a national museum of American Latino Museum, I think is the official name. And the way I see it is, it's that we have the opportunity for us within how we define Latinidad to highlight those elements. And to your point, like, yes, there's a difference between a Guatemalan, a Mexican, a Colombian, and there's things that are very unique to that region because of the original indigenous populations, because of the level of Afro descendants
Mm-hmm.
that came to that community, the level of European immigration that came during the conquest or in subsequent
Mm-hmm.
years as countries tried to quote unquote whiten their populations, or after World War I, after World War II, and all those things. So there's a lot of richness there, but I think we also have a common, a very common experience, and a lot of elements that we do need to celebrate and acknowledge, and also learn more about the differences, right? So let's learn more about why is an indigenous person from Guatemala very different from an indigenous person in another part of the continent, and also what they have in common, and learn more about their traditions and things like that. So we do have the opportunity for us to become more aware. Maybe this is part of the conversation that we need to have, to say, okay, well, how do we make sure that Latinidad, that you feel comfortable with what Latinidad um, stands for, and if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, well, how can we change it? And if it doesn't fit, like, okay, so what term are we going to use?
Yeah.
How are we going to identify ourselves?
Yeah, and also I hope that movements like this allow us to put pressure on networks like Univision and Telemundo to start portraying our communities in a more like multivaried way, so that we don't end up always being the servants in the novelas, or I'm not even sure how they depict. Mexico again doesn't even want to acknowledge that they have an Afro community. So you would know in Colombia, how do they depict the Afro Colombians? I'm sure it's like some negative characterization of them, right? Actually, Mexico had a show, La Cosa, where they used to make fun of Afro. There was this character named Tomas, and it was essentially blackface, like really, really degrading comedy at the expense of Afro Americanos. I forget if he was making fun of like an Afro Mexican from the South. It may have been, actually. So at least he was acknowledging that they existed, because other parts of Mexico don't. But I hope that we can put enough pressure on these guys to start portraying more complex storylines. For example, look, I want to see stories about indigenous people that, when the Spanish came, indigenous people that made deals with the Spanish, even if they backstabbed other Mexicans, like the Tlaxcalans that backstabbed the Aztecs. I want to see that, because they weren't all victims. And I know that slavery was terrible, but that doesn't mean that within the black community in the Americas, in North America or in South America, that you didn't have people that were pulling moves, that were scheming and plotting with each other to get an advantage over others. Because this is just
resisting too.
Yeah, and resisting as well. Yeah, exactly. So not only were they resisting, they were scheming, they were like cruel to each other, they were victims, they were also oppressors, maybe within their groups. I want to see all that. And I want to see, especially like, as you mentioned, I want to see the stories of those that resisted, because there's so much rich material there. I bet you if they celebrated Afro and indigenous culture the way that they celebrate European, how many stories do you think we would have about our ancestors and like the stories of them resisting? Look, if you read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, he tells you this, and this is a white author telling us this, but he tells you that there were African Americans that when they brought them from Africa, sorry, they were slaves, that when they brought them from Africa, they would not submit to slavery. Like literally, you had to kill them because they would not submit, because they kept resisting and resisting and resisting and resisting, and you could not kill their will and you could not kill their spirit, and you had to kill them. And I know it's like gruesome and terrible, but people have to hear these stories, because otherwise what they do is they portray this culture of victimization, that the Afro descendants, the African Americans and Afro people, indigenous people, were nothing but victims, and that it was
docile.
Exactly. And that's pure BS that they perpetuate. And so yeah, we should put pressure. And I'm not in that field, right? I hope I was in the but maybe in a decade or two, if I have the time, to start writing some stories and maybe start helping bring these things to stories, movies, or whatever, to try to tell these stories, because there's just so many, and it's so lazy, honestly, like to watch novelas and they go for the same old tired characterizations of indigenous and other groups of people. Like, come on, be a little more creative, like do some fucking research and portray these people correctly. They weren't all like these, what do they call them, noble beasts? Yeah, they're poor and there's virtue and poverty, but I mean, some of these guys were pretty terrible too. Just give us the whole spectrum. Give us the whole spectrum of the people, because they did have a spectrum, and obviously we know why they do it, because it's part of the colonization process to portray people that way, because then it's easier to either control them or to get people against them, or to strip them of their land, or to say that they're inconsequential, and to get the rest of the population to not care about them as much, to label them as savages, or what's the common word that they like to say, the civilized. So anyhow, that's I think I just went on a rant there, but I think you get the point.
No, but it's interesting because just this week I learned about C.L.R. James, a historian that did a lot of work to talk about the history of the Caribbean and the history of Haiti. So actually, I was listening to this conversation or this lecture on the history of revolt in Haiti and the Haitian independence.
Mm-hmm.
And the lecturer was talking about the fact that Africans fought and resisted slavery in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
They resisted it in when they got to the port to be sent off. They resisted it in the ships. That's why they had to. The slave traders had to like bond them and do them so that they wouldn't jump and rebelled. They rebelled when they got to the Caribbean. They rebelled when they got to the United States and other parts. So yeah, so it's that story of untold stories about how people have fought and how they really empower themselves and the fact that they have agency and they have the ability to change their destinies.
Yeah, and then there's also so many stories of slaves that just ran away. And they ran away. They would run away
Yeah.
and live off with the Native Americans, or they would run away and live off the land. They would just go to a part of the United States that hadn't been settled, and then they just live there.
Yeah,
And
the
and
maroon colonies,
yeah,
maroon, and then in Colombia they call them palenques.
yeah. Like, look, man, there's a story right there for you. There's a novela. There's a movie right there. There's like dozens of movies right there. Stories that they can tell.
Yeah,
And
well, you may be proud of the Colombians because actually they did this story called La Esclava Blanca,
uh huh.
which is the story about this, you know, Spanish family who had an hacienda. The bad Spanish, they kill her parents, so she gets adopted by her slaves, and she lives with them in the Palenque. Then she goes to Spain, comes back, and then she reconnects with her back black relatives and falls in love with her childhood friends. But anyway, so
Yeah.
it's a story that's being told is still obviously from the lens of the white savior, but I still at least it's one of those stories that is out there. So you should check it out, La Esclava Blanca.
Yeah, and I think that's a step in the right direction, but you hit the nail on the head when you said it still features a central role for a white actor, because they still want to communicate that in order for your story to be relevant, in order for your deeds to matter, they have to involve a European. The stories that we need to get to a place where our stories are just about our people, and they could be stories that predate the Europeans. If you want to talk about indigenous people, and when it comes to African Americans, or slaves or descendants of slaves, it'll be a little harder because you're mixed in with already with the dominant group that's arrived from Europe. But the stories can still be just focused on the characters that we want to portray, and it doesn't have to be like the white savior complex where everything has to always gravitate towards the white lead actors. So I think we'll get there eventually, and I think obviously we have to do our part as well. We're talking about it. We're saying that it matters to us. There's other people that eventually, when they get to positions where they can write stories and produce them, that I hope that they do go into this direction, because I mean, I look personally, I think they're missing out. I think there's so much. There's so many different stories that they can tell. They're like, people by now, aren't they tired of all these timepieces from 1600, 1700 England, like watching the wealthy live their life of opulence and like Pride and Prejudice? And I mean, those are good stories, but come on, dude, there's so many other stories that you can tell that doesn't have to be that.
That's true. And I think part of it will come with our ongoing economic empowerment, right? Like to your point, supporting authors that tell our stories, buying their books, buying their movies, demanding and letting folks know that hey, we're interested in seeing ourselves in TV. And I think that's an aspect where Latinos, um, African Americans, Native Americans, and others are still fighting. But I do think that part of that is telling our own stories and demanding our own stories, not only politically but also through our economic influence.
Yeah, let's do it. I feel energized. Let's go start filming a movie right now. We can write the script on the way there.
That's why our social media is the Brown Perspective TV, because eventually we're gonna come up with TV content for your
Yeah.
mind.
No, and I don't want to diminish how difficult it is to write good stories. So I'm sure if we wrote a story within a week, I'm sure it wouldn't be very good. Yeah, it takes a lot to write a good story. So I'm not saying that and that just anyone can do it, but I think eventually we will get.
Yeah, and and like just like there's bad stories and bad movies that get made, but we still need to have that opportunity to fail and to try something, to maybe tell a story that, oh yeah, that story wasn't good, but at least we published it, it got out there, and maybe that inspires or helps get to another story that it
Mhm.
is great, that it does capture
Yeah, and
the essence of our work. So yeah, there's plenty of room for a lot of creative content from our voices in our community.
and I think one of the biggest challenges that we had to this has already been struck down, which is trying to get past the executives and those that would fund the projects when they would say that you can't make a movie with an all black cast because it won't sell, because we already
Hmm.
had the Black Panther that disproved that. So yeah, so these things, they happen gradually, but you can see the progress because now they can't claim that it's a movie that it had a predominantly black cast, and even though they were saying they were worried that it wasn't going to do as well, but now we have that as the example. It sets a precedence. So now I'm hoping that that opens a door for other types of stories to be told with a predominantly indigenous or Afro cast. So looking forward to that.
And The Heights is going to be that next the movie within the Latino space that's going to help us get there too.
Are they working on a movie for In the Heights?
Yeah, so the movie's done. They were going to air it this June, but they postponed it to next year because of the pandemic.
Ah, okay. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Cool. All right. Any final thoughts on this? So are we a thumbs up or thumbs down on getting rid of Latinidad?
Well, I guess, we're still having a conversation.
Okay.
So if it's not Latinidad, what is it? And so yeah, so I appreciate the dialogue.
Sounds good. Pues. All right. Just anyone out there, if you like what you hear, then follow us on YouTube. We are at The Brown Perspective. We're also on Twitter and on Facebook. Okay. Nos vemos.
Ciao.